associate of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, and a professor emerita of Russian at UMass Boston. I'm also the coordinator of the Humanities Study Group at Davis Center, which for obvious reasons is meeting remotely today. And I have to thank the staff at the Davis Center for making this possible. Our speaker today is Magda Romanska, who is Associate Professor of Theater Studies and Dramaturgy at Emerson College in Boston, and a prolific writer, dramaturge, and theater performance and media scholar. Magda is graduated from Stanford's honor program in modern thought and literature, and Cornell's doctoral program in theater, film, and dance. In addition to being a center associate at the Davis Center, she's also a research associate at the Center for European Studies at Harvard, and executive director and editor-in-chief of the theatertimes.com. Her past books and publications cover the areas of post-traumatic theater, a theory of comedy and dramaturgy. She's the author or editor of 4 critically acclaimed theater books, including The Post-Traumatic Theater of Grotowski and Cantor, Reader and Comedy, an anthology of theater and criticism, which he co-edited with Alan Ackerman, the Rutledge Companion to Dramaturgy, a leading handbook of dramaturgy, and Theater Machine, Tadeusz Kantor, in Context, which he co-edited with Kathleen Chiaffi, if that's how you pronounce her name. She's also the sole editor of a 10-volume series focused on dramaturgy to be released within the next 2 years from Rutledge. Aside from Emerson, she has taught at Harvard, the Yale School of Drama, and Cornell University, and she has also worked on over 30 theater and opera productions as either dramaturg, playwright, or director, and served as the resident dramaturg for the Boston Lyric Opera. The title of Dr. Romanska's presentation today is Post-Colonial Approaches to Central and Eastern European Theater. So right now I will turn it over to Dr. Romanska and to give her presentation.
Thank you so much, Edith, for this presentation, and thank you to Davis Center for having me. I much welcome the opportunity. I want to talk today about this approach to Eastern and theater and Central and Eastern European theater through the post-colonial theory and problems that might emerge when we try this approach, and the reason why I think we might consider this approach. The project started as an attempt to address a problem within theater and performance studies, which is the fact that Central and Eastern European theater is virtually absent from the canon. And let me just share with you the screen share. So hold on 1 second. In Anglo-American tradition, the history of Central and Eastern European drama has been predominantly taught in Slavic departments. In theater and performance studies departments, Central and Eastern European drama appear not to exist pre-1960s. A Polish romantic drama, for example, has remained predominantly a domain of Slavic studies, often subjected to the same mode of criticism as lyric poetry. As such, it has remained on the margins, plagued by scarce and outdated critical and theoretical research and by the virtual absence of English language translations of the actual plays. Thus, the theater and performance canon suffers from the lack of inclusion of Central and Eastern European plays and theater. And I'm giving you here a list of different anthologies. Most of them only have the Cherry Orchard as being the sole play which represents an Eastern European theater. And this includes both the Wadzorov, the Longman, Ducor, as well as the latest anthology, the Norton Anthology of Drama, which also only has a Cherry Orchard in its list of Eastern European drama. This is a kind of an issue because it's very difficult to understand contemporary Eastern European theater without understanding, like in case of Poland, for example, without understanding and knowing Polish romantics. And Daniel Gero, for example, wrote that Polish romantic drama, and I quote, in contrast to the imaginative sweeps and breadth of shown by Mickiewicz, the fuss about Hernani and Hugo's writing on the subject seem parochial, formalistic, and no longer of much importance. So there is quite a wealth of drama, particularly romantic drama, that is not well understood by theater and performance scholars, and as a result, not many people actually are able to understand um, the contemporary Polish theater. The problem of treating Polish romantic drama as drama and not poetry lies in the fact that it was not written to be performed, written under partitions like most dramas of Central and Eastern European region. The drama of the 18th and 19th century was not expected to be staged. Therefore, applying typical dramaturgical tools to its analysis is complicated. And that's one of the reasons why I think this drama remained a domain of the Slavic language, of the Slavic department, where it's analyzed as lyric poetry and not necessarily as drama. So the question that I want us to think about today is, can we, okay, hold on, let me just see. Can drawing the lines of comparison between Central and Eastern Europe and other parts of the world through the tools of postcolonial critique open the literary and dramatic repertoire of Central and Eastern European nations to greater inclusion in the European and global theater and performance canon? So this is the question that I want to explore today. In other words, can looking through the prism of postcolonial theory help us devise a dramaturgical tools of analysis of Central and Eastern European drama that would not just allow us for its inclusion in the canon, but also help theater and performance scholars understand contemporary Central and Eastern European theater and performance. So since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, there has been a significant shift in the field of Slavic studies from the purely historiographic research favored for many years to critical theory, including a broader interdisciplinary view of Central and Eastern European history, now being re-examined through the prism of trauma studies and postcolonial theory. The shift, which began in historical research, has affected the field of literary studies and film studies as well. How did the critical approach in Slavic studies shift on account of postcolonial theory, and what are the limits and possibilities of this shift, particularly for theater and performance studies? Postcolonial theory emerged primarily as an economy-based critical tool in the context of Western Europe's conquest of Southeast Asia, Africa, and Pacific Rim, and the complex cultural, social, economic, and political legacy that continue long after the fall of the British Empire and other colonial powers. Drawing further on interdisciplinary research in anthropology, sociology, history, cultural, and literary studies, postcolonial theory engaged a multitude of issues from across many fields and geographic regions. And just to remind people, um, um, the key concept of the postcolonial theory, let me see. Include the critique of representation and otherness, the construction of national identities, the transnational hybridity, the agency of the subaltern, the oppositional resistance, and the nesting Orientalism, which is basically a kind of an internal colonization. The four main theorists, Fanon, Said, Baba, and Spivak, whose work provided a blueprint for much of the later development of postcolonial critique, built on the post-structuralist concept of the self as constructed and imagined through the intersection of language and representation. In Orientalism, Said defines colonialism as foremost a political and racial project of Orientalization, a Western style of dominating, reconstructing, and having authority over the Orient through imagined constructs that imagined Eastern societies as being all fundamentally similar or sharing crucial characteristics not necessarily possessed by Western societies. End of quote. Building on Said's work in the location of culture, Amibaba defines the concept of postcolonial hybridity and mimicry, arguing that past experiences of colonialism constantly interfere with the present moment, dislocating and destabilizing cultural identities and their representations. Once trapped in the trauma of colonial binaries, a post-colonial culture replicates in linguistic, social, and political power arrangements, making the reconstruction of the pre-colonial imaginary impossible. Adding the dimension of gender criticism in a critique of postcolonial reason, Gayatri Spivak argues that colonized women's agency and voice is further erased. The postcolonial condition creates subcategories of difference, whereas women and other marginalized subjects are further trapped between the two incongruous symbolic systems that rule over them within the context of colonized and colonizing cultures. The concept of layered subalternity that Spivak theorized has become particularly important in the context of multicultural nesting Orientalism, whereas many cultures, races, and ethnicities engage in mutual and interconnected colonial and subcolonial interdependencies. The foundational discourse of postcolonial criticism problematizes the concept of national and cultural identity, literary and artistic representations, and social and political and economic power arrangements. Central and Eastern European scholars have been arguing about how relevant and fitting it is to apply the post-colonial critique, which were based primarily on racial difference, to the countries of the Second World, where the colonizing impulse was predominantly influenced by the many unclear and unstable ethnic and cultural differences. Many other scholars, including Claire Kavanagh, Isabella Sorint, Robert Nelson, and others, have been arguing that applying post-colonial criticism to Central and Eastern Europe can expand our understanding of the political, economic, and social cultural relations in the region. Janusz Korek argues that, quote, national chauvinism discriminate against the individual in a similar way, collectivizing them and writing them into some greater community, which then is then regarded for various reasons as less valuable or indeed completely worthless, end of quote. Isabella Sorent notes that by excluding the Central and Eastern Europe from the scope of their analysis, the main critics of postcolonialism seem to suggest that these critical tools cannot be used in the analysis of Central and Eastern Europe. Sorent argues against this exclusion, noting that historical circumstances surrounding the imperial ambitions of the 19th century powers, be they England or Russia, share a similar set of characteristics, regardless of whether it's racial or ethnic differences that form the basis for the colonial relations. Likewise, Claire Kavanagh, in her essay on post-colonial Poland, argues that although our understanding of the concept of imperialism and colonialism has been built around the relationship between the first and the third world countries, the omission of the second world from this equation is not appropriate. A quote, surely the Russian Empire and its 20th century descendants and the Soviet Union would seem to merit a place in contemporary assessment of imperialism and its cultural consequences. The application of the post-colonial theory to Eastern and Central Europe is somewhat complicated by a very specificity of the region. Here I'm just looking at Poland and the multiple partitions that happened during the 18th and 19th century create quite a complex landscape that makes it difficult to even define the boundaries and the lines of what is and isn't, a post-colonial period. And the application of post-colonial theory to Central and Eastern Europe has been complicated by the layered historical narrative with multiple waves of colonial and quasi-colonial political arrangements plaguing the region for the last 3 centuries. The circumstances surrounding the imperial ambitions, formation, and dissolution of Central and Eastern European empires, the Russian Empire, the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Habsburg monarchy, as well as Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, do present a conundrum as to which restructuring of the borders constitutes an authentic form of colonization and which is an expected result of multiple local conflicts. Thus, the Russian, Prussian, and Austro-Hungarian empires that emerged in the 18th century and that partitioned and eventually came to dominate the smaller Central and Eastern European nations, including Poland, Ukraine, and Bohemia, among others, as well as those imperial powers that emerged after two World War Ones, have not been traditionally seen as colonial powers, with scholars arguing about which historical moment, the 19th century partitions or 20th century totalitarianism, should indeed be classified as colonial, and hence, when does the post-colonial actually start? Although the circumstances, mechanism, and political formations varied significantly between these two historical periods, the forces that shaped each of them share many similarities with the colonial forces that shaped the relationship between the West and its colonies, including the dissolution of the conquered nations and nation states, ethnic cleansings and genocides, the banning and elimination of regional languages and cultures, and the marginalization and othering of the conquered subjects and nations. Many countries, such as Poland and the Kingdom of Bohemia, ceased to exist, becoming the ultimate political and national version of the Derridian ontological riddle. They became the countries that were not. Or, as Benedict Anderson put it, they became the perfect imagined communities bearing a national identity that existed solely through their shared language and historical memory rather than being based on any tangible geographic location or institutional statehood. From the Western European perspective, the two countries, Poland and Bohemia, for example, became either a joke or a mythical land of penury-stricken artisan gypsies. Yeah, most famously, the French avant-garde playwright Alfred Jarry set his absurdist play Uburwa in Poland, that is to say, nowhere. Jarry's choice reflected a general Western view of Poland's political position. Even mentioning of Poland's existence appeared to be a good subject for the absurdist play. Um, and the same was in the case of Bohemia, the country's precarious situation and the influx of bedraggled immigrants from the region to Western Europe evoked the lifestyle of the artistic underclass, thus eventually in the mid-19th century providing a name for the social and economic subgroup, La Boheme. Dorosa Sosnowska points out that the history of Central and Eastern Europe was too complex and national relations too complicated to allow us to distinguish two distinct discourses, the discourse of the colonizers and the discourse of the colonized. The same communities which revolted against domination of the ruling culture saw nothing wrong in dominating cultures whose achievement they considered ethnographic phenomena. End of quote. Other scholars suggest that we should differentiate between internal and external colonialism. The first refers to the colonization of the local other within one society, um, while the second, colonizing, is the classical form. Yet the ruling class of one, the ruling of one country by another. In case of Poland, for example, a number of factors form the multiple layers of both internal and external colonizing process. On the one hand, a sense of inferiority to both the three colonizing empire and the West, very much influenced Poland's own internal colonizing impulses towards its own minorities. On the other hand, the external hegemonic powers viewed the internal conflict as beneficial to their own interests, often inciting local animosities, which contributed to the internal breakage of social and cultural relations within the colonized territories. As a result of these factors, Central and Eastern Europe experienced what Bakich Hayden calls nesting Orientalism, or a gradation of the Orients, with every Orient having its own Orient. Or, as Dorota Sosnowska notes, almost everyone happened to be a victim and an oppressor. The complicated national relations in Central and Eastern Europe, the multifaceted crisscrossing at different angles, does not allow us to differentiate a clear-cut borders between the colonized and colonizing um, um, entities. This array of ambivalent power relations in the context of Central and Eastern Europe creates many problems, and I'm going to list them for everyone to see. Um, so First, since many countries dual colonized and colonizer position makes it difficult to trace unequivocal power relations, this in turn makes the analysis of cultural output inevitably ambiguous and hermetic. The classifications, whether national or linguistics, are unstable and fraught with paradoxes. In case of Poland, the dual colonizer role manifested itself through the paradoxical post-colonial mentality, which meant, on the one hand, acknowledging one's marginality and inferiority to the West, and on the other, through exhibiting feelings of superiority and colonial longings. As Sosnowska suggests, that the Polish post-colonial mentality reveal a certain schizophrenia of contradictory national self-definition, soteriological messianism, sometimes bordering on megalomania on the one hand, and feelings of inferiority on the other. The historically schizophrenic nature of the Polish national identity during the period of colonization, shared by many other colonized countries in the region, exemplifies the difficulty and challenges of postcolonial analysis in the context of Central and Eastern Europe. The second problem, the very definition of the colonial relationship needs to be carefully framed to adequately represent the complexity of the Central and Eastern European colonialist critique. Writing about Ireland as an internal British colony, Michael Hechter offers a definition of colonialism that considers foremost the economic foundation of the colonial conquest. Hechter's definition of colonialism takes the division of labor legitimized by racial, ethnic, or cultural differences as the basis of the power relations between the center and its colonies. The power centers that are located within the colonial territories, Hechter argues, interact with their peripheries via predatory economic policies. Historians, including Larry Wolff and Jürgen Osterhamel, consider Hechter definitions inadequate to describe the situation of Central and Eastern Europe. Osterhamel argues that each colonial situation was based on a different economic conditions. There are significant differences between the colonial economies of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Thus, we need a more universal definition of colonialism that would take into account shared commonalities between different economic and historical circumstances. For that reason, Ostermacher proposes a definition of colonialism based not on economic, but on political, social, and cultural factors. Much closer to the definitions proposed by Said, Baba, and Fanon, which are based on post-structuralist concept of the colonized other's distorted sense of national identity and self-definition. Ostermacher approach to colonialism help us to adequately understand and describe polycentric domination relationships in the multicultural societies of Central and Eastern Europe. The conquest and partition of the smaller nation states that began in the 18th century was guided by its own particular set of economic, social, cultural, and political conditions, and it needs its own theoretical approach to fully grasp the complexity involved in the cultural output of the region. When analyzing Central and Eastern Europe, one needs to be aware that the traumatic break between the pre and post colonial moments cannot be visibly marked in the same way it can be marked in the relation to Western colonialism. Thus, it is difficult to delineate clean boundaries of the Central and Eastern European process of colonization, as overlapping conflicts, conquest, and political arrangements created multiple historical and geographic layers of unstable narratives and power relations, each with different social, cultural, and political objectives. As a result of the complicated colonial history of the 18th and 19th century, the Central and Eastern Europe of the interwar period can be already viewed as post-colonial. The countries that gained independence after World War I, including Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, among others, were struggling to define their newly reclaimed national identities vis-à-vis their colonial past through the many transcultural processes of hybridity, mimicry, and oppositional resistance. As Josh Grabovich notes, Ukrainian territories were both under Russia and at first Poland and then Austria-Hungary and later within the Soviet Union and under Poland. Hence, to quote Janusz Korek, the Russians Russified the Ukrainians, the Poles Polonized them, but the Russians also Russified the Poles who in turns were repolonized by the Poles. End of quote. Likewise, the Czech criticized Polish short-sightedness on the Ukrainian issue. They display similar short-sightedness on the Slovak issue. End of quote. The relationships in the Balkans between Serbs, Croatians, and Bosnians were similarly complicated. The second wave of colonial expansion in Central and Eastern Europe, which took place in the 20th century and included World War II and the period from 1945 until 1989, presents another challenge when viewed and analyzed through the prism of post-colonial theory. Scholars disagree as to whether the Nazi occupation and Soviet occupation during and after World War II should be considered instances of colonial expansion. In his 1964 book, Communism and Colonialism, Walter Kollasch drew an even more decisive comparison between the two hegemonic systems, arguing that Soviet Russia's anti-imperialist stand was used to cover up its own imperial conquests and ambitions. Radim Hladik argued that post-socialist and post-colonial countries share many characteristics and that they should be discussed from a comparative perspective. The best argument for the application of post-colonial theory to World War II and the period after has been the cultural residue of those events. Edward Lucas points out that Polish-Russian relations, for example, have been marked by such a long history of colonization that pathological drama is inevitable. The 19th century colonization of Central and Eastern Europe by the three empires involved foremost the elimination of the native colonized cultures as part of the civilizing mission that guided the process of partitions. The post-Enlightenment ideals of the civilizing mission dominated the Prussian expansion, providing justification for the Germanization of the conquered territories. The processes of Germanization in the West and Russification in the East were influenced by the imperial ambitions and self-perceived cultural, economic, and political superiority of the empires, which legitimized the erasure of local colonized cultures and languages. Stephen Watson calls the colonial efforts at the eradication of the local native cultures and languages official nationalism, which in Benedict Anderson's words can be understood as a means for combining naturalization with retention of dynastic power, in particular over the huge polyglot domains accumulated since the Middle Ages, or to put it another way, for stretching the short, tight skin of the nation over the gigantic body of the empire, end of quote. Anderson notes that the Russification was one of the best examples of official nationalism. For the literature and drama of the colonized territories, there were a number of significant consequences of absence of national statehood um, um, because the drama filled in the gap. One consequence was the emergence of what Vitaly Chernetsky calls literature centrism, a process by which literature replaced the nation state and became a source of national identity. Again, in case of Poland, this was particularly true for the emergence of the romantic drama. Polish poets had more immediate source for their romantic idealism and the loss of their own political independence than the romantic poets in the West, particularly in Germany and France. For that very reason, as Kundera suggests, Mickiewicz, romantic poetry and drama can be considered foundational for Poland's sense of national identity. Polish literature, particularly Polish romantic drama, became as primary signifier of the national identity. As Polish scholar Jerzy Zomek notes, with the loss of independence, Polish literature became a proxy for non-existent state institutions. Romantic literature united people under a common liberatory messianic narrative with the Polish language as a stand-in for the non-existent state and nationhood. In the place of absent geographic and administrative ties, language and literature played an essential role in national survival. The colonial condition also influenced the dramatic form itself. For example, most Polish national dramas um, were written um, um, for reading and not for performance. They had a loose and dramatic structure, very much in opposition to the classic drama of Victor Hugo, Ibsen, or Strindberg. Often these dramas more closely resembled poetry than dramatic works. For that reason, they are sometimes referred to as dramato-poems. The reason for the Polish drama's undramatic form was that they were never meant to be staged. Most were politically themed, and there was simply no possibility that any theater in partitioned Poland would be permitted to produce them. Um, but Daniel Garot also noticed that the unique situation of Polish romantics evolved from its particular political situation. All three Polish romantic poets, Mickiewicz, Słowacki, and Krasicki, wrote their plays in exile, never expecting them to be performed. They were written for the theater that existed only in the imagination of their authors. So they were sort of imagined theater. The literature centrism of the colonized, however, presents its own problems within the context of postcolonial analysis. For once, literature-centric analysis assumes that, as Jamieson put it, all colonized texts are necessarily allegorical, because it's not possible to discuss political situation directly, so you have to use metaphor and allegory. Although the post-colonial approach to Central and Eastern Europe can help us see not only what the text says, but also, to quote Gayatri Spivak, what it cannot say. It can help us to see the negative ontology. Viewing all texts of the colonized nations with the prism of post-colonial resistance, on the other hand, can provide a very limited perception of these cultures as incapable of producing any output outside of the political framework of the colonizing experience. This very narrow view of the colonized cultures can make them seem hermetic and inaccessible to anyone unfamiliar with the complex colonial landscape of power and politics that shaped them. Um, it also suggests that people entangled in colonial situations are incapable of producing literary or dramatic works that could speak to broader transcultural experience. One strategy of the post-colonial critique of the Central and Eastern European cultural outputs, including literature, theater, and performance, is to rethink the essentialist national categories that have been often delineated by present-day borders, and instead to focus on the multi-ethnic hybrid foundations of the analyzed texts. This requires rethinking the psychogeography of the region. Theater in particular has been a challenging aspect of the Eastern and Central European culture, as its meta-theatrical role has been foremost to perform the spectacle, the ocular proof of the national unity by deconstructing and reconstructing a sense of national difference. Theater and opera were essential to nation building because they provided a platform for the evolution of a national discourse by enacting and solidifying a shared sense of national identity. For this reason, they also became politically contested sites. If, as Janusz Korek notes, the fundamental dilemma facing post-colonial theories and one of the most important notions for them is cultural identity, then theater, with its role in nation building and the construction of national identities, should be one of the most important lenses through which we can analyze the social, political, and cultural complexities of Central and Eastern Europe. Um, Thank you very much, Edith.
Mute now, okay. Took me a little while to unmute, sorry about that. Thank you so much, Magda, for that very informative and provocative talk. I have several questions, and then I think we'll turn it over to our chat questions after that. Something that actually you mentioned to me in our discussion before when you were talking about an example of how the omission of knowledge of dramatic works from, from Central and Eastern European culture kind of limits understanding of modern culture. And you had one example among contemporary works, which I think you wanted to mention. So could you talk about that briefly?
Yes, I'm very excited about this example. It's, of course, The Witcher, which is, the highest premiere Netflix series right now, which is based on extremely popular video game. And the video game is based on the Polish book by Sapkowski, which is in turn based on Adam Mickiewicz's dramatic poem, The Forefathers' Eve. And when we play the game Witcher or when we watch Netflix, show, we can see very well the influence of the Polish Romantic poetry and Polish Romantic drama on that work. The premise, like I have a little slide I can actually show you. Hold on, let me just share it with you. The poem in question, the drama in question is Adam Mickiewicz, Jade, The Forefathers' Eve. The Jade itself is a quite complicated work. It has 4 parts, and they different in their narrative construction. But one of the the themes of Jade is the messianic and liberatory longings of the Polish nation, but it's intertwined with these pagan rituals of bringing up the dead. So the dead souls are coming to ask for forgiveness or to ask for different things because they are kind of stuck in between this life and the afterlife. There's something happen in their, during their lifetimes, which makes them impossible to move on into the afterlife. So they are kind of stuck in the middle, and they are recalled. They are called in this ritual to come and tell what their needs are, and then the human beings, provide for those needs, and the souls can move on and go into the eternity. And so in the video game, and we cannot play the video apparently because YouTube is blocking it, everyone, videos if they're trying to play it. But I guess we're gonna post the link to the YouTube video, which has a very short bit from The Witcher, which pretty much is a stage version of the Forefathers Eve. So The Witcher is kind of trying to save the people from those dead souls, which for some reason cannot be sent back, and they are like walking zombies that wreak havoc on the villages. And so that it's sort of would be difficult for the game scholars or film scholars or television scholars or any contemporary scholars to understand what Witcher means unless you actually read this romantic drama. And luckily for us, the first translation was just released recently in full. The full translation was never done before, so right now it's available and you can read it. So this is just one good example that shows us how, because Witcher, the video game, is it's a Polish video game. It was made by Polish game designers. So it sort of shows you how this is the culture influenced pretty much every aspect of Polish culture, and how this romantic drama influence, now it's influencing a global pop culture. So, it really demands to be included in the canonical theatrical canon. And in all of those anthologies that are being released, it has never been included. But I think we need to rethink it because it's now a part of the global culture. So this is one kind of cool example that I hope will encourage people to study more Polish romantic drama.
Yes, thank you, Magda. The other question that I found sort of intriguing, all of the Polish romantic poets who were writing dramas and obviously other works were in exile. And I was wondering what the function was of Poles in exile in preserving Polish identity, Polish culture, from abroad. Were there, other literary works, newspapers, or political movements and so forth that really sort of kept the idea of Poland alive while the geographical Poland kind of disappeared?
Well, I mean, the one thing that was sort of important thing that happened was that the role of the poet, the role of the writer, of the playwright, became a kind of, a political role almost. Like he was the voice of the nation. He was the one who was both, sort of conscious of the nation and seen as such, yeah. And it's a kind of an interesting relationship between, the Poland and the diaspora. It's to a large degree, it also has to do with the sort of Polish-Jewish relationships and this sort of identification with the Jewish diaspora, and because those two cultures were so tight for so many centuries. And so there is this idea of Poland as a kind of almost like a mythical land to which you will return one day, and have goddess Faustus, who sort of is this anxiety-ridden existential, hero, that's like essentially a romantic hero. Yeah, in Poland and in other Eastern European nations, this was a little bit different because you had an actual political situation. So these romantic longings of the heroes were actually much more rooted in the actual situation. There was they risk their lives, and the existential anxieties often revolve not just around a kind of generic sense of existence, but around the ethical questions having to do with taking position vis-a-vis the colonizing powers. And so there was, you can say it's a little bit more complex, or you can say it's too specific for it to be seen as universal. I don't know. I mean, I think like the actual physical conditions of this heroes or these characters, um, does create a little bit more complex, perhaps, understanding of the of the dramatic form of the hero's journey, so to speak, or of the hero's transformation or the hero's dilemmas, and because they are rooted in such a complex political circumstances. So I think that the ambitions that German romantic poets had, or French romantic poets had, to make drama, and allegory for the nation, um, uh, didn't really maybe have a full chance to realize itself, because the nation was there. But if you don't have if you don't have a country, if you don't have institutions, then the drama will naturally become that which replaces it. When you do have a country, when you have a geographic region, when you have institutions, that competition is much it's much harder for the drama to become. So as much as I know what Schiller and Goethe were trying to accomplish, I think that um, it just didn't have the same circumstances which would allow it for that same um, thing to happen that happened in the Eastern Europe. And nonetheless, we know that romantic drama in Germany had quite a bit of influence of creating the German national identity, and this sort of romantic longings, and the desire for revenge and desire for reclaiming your national dignity after particularly World War One, have contributed to a kind of a you know trends which develop later on after World War One. So I think that those things can have two different ways of thinking and looking at it. So that was a good question. Thank you.
Yes, there's another kind of intriguing question dealing with the present day, which is, you mentioned that most of this theater is studied as lyrical poetry and not performed as more traditional theater. Does this new Zoom-based virtual reality we're living in provide an opportunity to do performative readings of the material to raise its profile?
Oh, that's great. Okay, so here's the thing. This stuff is performed in Poland and like Eastern Europe, like all the time. Like Forefathers Eve, like every director in Poland who like tries to, have a national profile needs to have their take on Forefathers Eve. Okay, so and like I watch, I don't know, like I think like 50 versions of Forefathers Eve. It's like a Hamlet for the British. Yeah. You don't watch it for the content, you watch it for the staging, like what does it say about the current moment, because it always responds to the current moment. So the staging of Forefathers Eve is like a symbol, or barometer, to quote Cantor, of the current political situation in Poland. So and some of those productions even travel, but it's like people look for the visual staging, because you don't really understand the text so much, and you don't know what's going on there, and you don't understand the cultural meaning of the text for the audience, for the local audience. So you can't really engage in that sort of complex exchange with the text and with the performance text. But I don't know. I mean, that's a good idea. There's a lot of good transmedia experiments happening online right now, with people, trying to figure out how to do theater online, or how to move on, creating art in the current circumstances. And I don't know, maybe it might be a good opportunity to explore some Polish romantic, poets in that format. Um, and, the transmedia format has been around for a while, but it's been kind of always, a little bit marginalized, versus the live theater. I mean, the very definition of theater seems to be that it has to be a live experience shared with other people. So there is always this debate, in theater studies, whether the mediated experience is in fact theater. So, are we in the pandemic? Is sort of, is this like post-theater, or how we gonna really define it, or how we gonna analyze it? It's still up to the debate. But this would be perhaps good opportunity to do some readings of the impossible dramas. Yeah, and John Muse has a book on that, on the dramas which never meant to be staged. There might be a good opportunity to stage them, since we don't have access to our stages right now to stage them. And so that's a pretty good question, and a good idea too for people to consider. Thank you so much for that one.
We're kind of running out of time, but maybe it's sort of a question that you could provide a link for. It says, do you have a reading suggestion to learn more about the concept of literature centrism, specifically the idea about finding identity in literature and drama rather than in political works? So do you have suggestions about further readings?
Well, you know what? I have to look at my bibliography, but there is actually quite a lot of stuff. I'm happy to post it after the presentation. I'll tag people. I will give them some titles for people to consider. Well, it's sort of interesting to think about it, actually, because right now we exist in a sort of the same comparable situation where we have, no theater to do so we sort of exist as an imagined communities without our public spaces. And so how will this new, tech-centric, Zoom-centric reality, what kind of art it will produce, what kind of impossible theaters will it produce? That's interesting to think about, because the conditions might be a little bit comparable perhaps to those experienced by the people in exile, where there was no public spaces for them to, actual spaces for them to discuss those things. So, that's a good way of thinking about it.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Magda, and thank everyone for the interesting questions. I think that we we're pretty much finished now. So I want to thank Magda again for this very provocative talk, and to thank other participants for their questions, and to end on the hope that one of these days we'll be meeting in actuality and not virtually. And so hopefully the day will come for theater and for lectures like ours as well. So for now, I will say goodbye to everybody and wish you a very happy summer.
I wanted to say thank you so much, Edith, for moderating the debate. The lecture, and thank you so much for David Center staff for the tech support, and for everyone who's watching and for asking questions.
Okay, good.